Welcome to the Fall 2021 Local Authors Night, hosted by the Thayer Public Library in Braintree, Massachusetts. Thank you for your support of our local authors. I'm Laurie Kavanaugh, Circulation Librarian. Tonight's program is being recorded for airing on BCAM TV and other community cable access stations. After each speaker, there will be a brief question and answer session. If you have questions for that author, please type them into the chat as they're speaking, and I'll pass them on during the question and answer session. Each author will have a chance to answer questions individually during the program, and then there should be time for additional questions after all of the authors have finished speaking. Now to introduce our panel of authors, and then I will be giving longer introductions of each of them right before their turn to speak. We have Roy Armstrong, author of the academic work, First Generation Women College Students Starving to Matter, revealing the lived experiences of a student population in crisis. Bob Demanche, did I mess it up? Demanche, also of Braintree, author of The Last of the Fairhaven Coasters, the story of Captain Claude S. Tucker and the schooner Coral. And we have Margie Mccreary of Hull. She's the author of The Disappearance of Trudy Solomon, a mystery novel. So our first speaker tonight is Dr. Arjo Alupis Armstrong, also known as Roy. She's the author, as I said, of First Generation Women College Students Starving to Matter, revealing the lived experiences of a student population in crisis. It's published by Lexington Books, a division of the academic publisher Rowman and Littlefield. Her book highlights the ways in which access to student resources, mattering, and marginalization can lead to larger issues, including mental health and food and housing insecurities. Roy is a higher education professional who lives with her husband and 3 children in Braintree. She has taught writing and education classes at Fitchburg State University, University of Massachusetts Lowell, Anna Maria College, and Bunker Hill Community College. She earned her bachelor's degree in English and International Affairs from the University of New Hampshire, her master's degree in English from Fitchburg State University, and her PhD in Leadership in Education from UMass Lowell. She loves to travel, read, and is an avid Red Sox fan.
Go Sox!
Go ahead, Roy. You're on.
Start. Okay, hi. It's like, is there more? Okay, I can listen to myself all this. Just kidding. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Love the library. Huge fan. So, yes, I wrote this book. And it was a labor of love. And, you know, before we really getting into talking about the book, I'd love to take just a couple of minutes and talk about the writing and publishing process, because I feel like I made a lot of mistakes. And maybe by talking about them, you won't do it. So that way, you know, I'm trying to help out here. So the publishing company actually found me. I was presenting the paper at a conference, the EERA conference, and it was about food insecurity in the female student population. And they found me in February of 2020. I got an email and said, hey, would you like to turn this into a book? Sure. Yes, please. Yeah, great. So I put together a proposal. That's a whole thing. We can have a whole separate Zoom about that. But it was about 5-6 pages. And basically what they really wanted me to do, what I realized as part of the publishing process, is sell my work, sell myself in terms of my writing. How is it going to be different from what's already out there? How can I market this? Like, what kind of network do I have that I can market it, right? So I put that in the proposal, talked about the book. She said yes. This was the time she got to it. It was May of 2020. And there, you know, like just a few things going on last May. And she said, I need this turned around by July. Oh, yeah, sure. No problem. Just let's write a whole book. So I'm thinking, oh, you know, copy, paste. No, so wrong. Oh, my goodness, because this started as a dissertation, very facts and figures. That's what my committee wanted, right? Dry, slightly interesting in places, but nothing you would like pick up voluntarily. And so I thought, well, if I'm going to make this palatable, which I wanted it to be, because it's just such an important story, and I need, I wanted to get it out there. I really need to make it more interesting and to put the heart back in. Everything in academia, when you're writing dissertations, you just take the heart out right in the beginning, they just say, just take it out. We don't need it. But so I had to put the heart back in. Okay. So I did that. And then what I would like to tell you as far as the writing and publishing process is I was my own editor. I did not have access to an editor. So that was fun. And it took me a long time. It took about 1.5 years. By the time they asked me if I wanted to do it and the book came out. So it was quite a lengthy process. I was in charge of writing my own endnotes, footnotes, and index. I don't know if anyone's ever written an index, but it's 22 pages of fun. I did make it to the other end. I got in the zone. So what I'm saying is be your own advocate, speak up for yourself. There were a couple points where they were trying to change the story. And I said, that's not what I sold you, and you really have to, again, hold your own, especially in the publishing world, and be willing to just put it out on the line, because this is an art form. This is your writing and your words and everything being out in the world. So, okay, the other thing I want to touch on, which I didn't know, is the way that the money works. So it's a long game. It's a long game when you're writing textbooks, nonfiction, especially higher ed, possibly. I won't see any money until July of 22. And that's only if I sell 250 copies. And only then do I get 7% of the purchase price, which is about $40 for the Kindle and like $85 to $90 for these. So don't quit your day job. That's all I have to say about the writing and publishing process. But it was wonderful. And it's such a dream. I have it on the mantle. Okay. So anyway, that's the writing and publishing. Let's get into talk about the book. So as I mentioned, it started as a dissertation. And the reason that I got to that, the reason I wrote, I will make it brief because I'm watching the time, is that I was teaching in higher ed, and I was paying attention to what the students were talking about. So there was a lot of textbook versus tuition versus food, and who would win? And it would be the textbooks and the tuition and not the food. And then a lot of people I heard would go to events around campus because there was free food, not necessarily because they were interested in what was happening. So I said to myself as a professor, how can I help, right? So I went to student affairs and I said, what do we have for resources? And then I started working with them. And at first I started looking at all the students, right? Because I just was interested in students in general. What did the research say? About 37% of students on average are food insecure. And what do I mean by food insecure? I mean, they don't have enough to eat. They're not purchasing enough food, so they're only living on fast food. Yes, I will write another book, Sandy, but we can get to that in a minute. Okay. Okay, so food insecurity, sorry. Shouldn't multitask. They don't have enough food for whatever reason, whether they're living off campus and there's no meal plan, or they purchase the cheapest meal plan and they run out of swipes before the end of the week. Whatever's going on, they're not eating enough. So I started off looking at that, did my research, found out that women were reporting more food insecurity. Okay, there's a gap right there in the research, right? Then I found when I did my interviews on campus that first-gen women were actually self-reporting food insecurity the most. And so that's what I tended to focus on. And I just want to add, we're going to get to this in a minute when I talk about my findings, that I started with food. I quickly learned that it's not just food, it's also student homelessness as well. So one could lead to the other. Either they're hungry, and because they can't purchase food, or they choose to purchase food over rent, they're living in the car, or vice versa, they're living in the car, so they have a place to sleep, but it's very hard to heat up food in a car. I don't know if you've ever tried it. And, when you open a can of beans in the car, tuna, it gets real messy, right? So that can also lead to food insecurity. So we're going to talk about that in a minute. So I started off with that, researched, and I'm going to just headline news it for you because we're running out of time. Let me tell you what I found out. Okay, so about 3 pillars of themes, I guess, that would emerge. The first one's mental health. I didn't have any questions about it. I was focused on food, right? And soon I discovered that homelessness was part of it and also mental health. So students, I mean, obviously now with the pandemic, we're really starting to talk about this a lot more. I started my research in 2019, 2020. Students had access to mental health, but it wasn't equal, right? So there was, if you were a traditional student, you started your freshman year, you're 18, you're living in the dorm, there's a lot of information about mental health. If you're a commuter student, you're not living in the dorm, they have a different orientation. It's not really mentioned as much. Now, if you're a transfer student, right, then you're coming in maybe your sophomore, junior year, you're not living in the dorm and you're not even the commuter, right? And you don't start from the beginning, there's even less information, right? So I found out that orientation can make a big difference in mental health. Also, the students where you have to watch the verbiage, right? So a lot of students would call their mental health centers wellness centers. Okay, I'm sorry, you're a first gen student. English maybe not be your first language. You look at a wellness center, you think, well, I have to be well, right? This has massages. Yeah, they do have massages, but that's also where the mental health counseling is. But how do you know that if you're calling it a wellness center, right? So there were some things. And also the other thing I found out is that the print materials and the advertising, we could do a whole book just on how they advertise resources, but I will be brief. I will just say that they mainly rely on emails, which is not as effective because, hello, people don't read their emails in 2021, not 18-year-olds anyway. They don't go to Facebook either, which is the other place that advertising tends to happen. So you got to meet the students where they are. Okay, mental health, how they advertise. The other finding is that, oh gosh, how do I say this? It's not that, okay. So the students, the title in the book, Starving to Matter, I put matter on purpose, right? Because I find that matter, belonging, and marginalization were areas in which the students weren't feeling like they mattered, if they didn't feel belong and connected. Lori, my timer shut off, so tell me when I'm close, okay? Thank you.
Got about a minute.
Oh, good. Okay. So when those three things happened, if the university had a food pantry, right? That was an encouraging signal to students that they mattered, that their concerns mattered. They have a department for it. You know, if they had a student affairs department where when you come in to talk about other things, are they asking you if you've eaten, right? So that's a way. Then on the opposite end, when they're feeling marginalized, so when they're not seeing their needs being met and they're not seeing, like commuter students don't know there's a parking waiver that can reduce their parking fees, right? And if they knew that, that would help them feel a little more connected. So anywho, I'm out of time, but what I will just say is that I found that it was, I started out to study food, and I found that food is actually what happens at the end of everything else, right? So there has to be all these other pieces that go into it before students are really struggling with basic need challenges. So thank you.
That was great, Roy. Thank you. We do have time for some questions, and there have been a few come in through the chat. The first one you mentioned was, will you write another book?
Yes. I don't know about this topic. I would love to, but I'd have to start more research. But yes, I will. Thank you.
Okay. And then how does food insecurity relate to tuition costs and other college costs?
Yes. Good question. We don't have time. I have a whole chapter in here. But what I will say is tuition costs, obviously, I don't think it's a shocker here. Those are rising. And I don't know if anyone in this group has children in college. I do. But the financial aid has not met those needs. So that the financial aid piece, where it used to be that you could get a Pell Grant, which is a grant from the government that you didn't need to pay back, those income levels have been adjusted so low at this point that it is rare that I even meet anyone who is on a Pell Grant unless they are homeless or in a very desperate situation. So that is so tuition costs, and I don't know if you realize, but tuition costs is one thing, and then they have these things called fees, right? And the tuition and the fees are almost exactly the same, and then you add in housing. And it actually makes the tuition look cheap, right? Because actually the fees and the housing that are even more than the tuition. And food insecurity, a lot of people assume when you go into college, your freshman year, you have to have a meal plan, right? That's just the assumption. What they have done is they used to have a couple different tiers of meal plans, right? They had like the Cadillac plan, which is you eat all the time. And then they had the medium one, and then they had the lowest one. Well, what they're trying to do to encourage people, a lot of people said, we're not going to live on campus because the meal plan's too expensive. So what they did is they adjusted the meal plan so the fewer swipes. So you're only getting maybe 2 swipes a day for 5 days. Well, hello, what do you do when you get to the weekend, right? You're hungry. You're living in a dorm. You don't have access to a kitchen. And because you're paying your tuition, and because you're living on campus, and because you don't have that financial aid piece that's as high, because financial aid only covers your textbooks. You get a waiver for textbooks and your tuition fees. It doesn't include living expenses. You're expected to provide that on your own. And they really don't offer a lot of aid for living expenses. So,
yeah. The other question that has come in relates to finding a publishing company for any aspiring authors. So you specifically published with an academic publisher, which is a little different.
It is. They found me, yes. But going forward, I'm in the same boat. So finding a publishing company for aspiring authors. Actually, you know what I would suggest? I actually would suggest self-publishing, because here's what I've learned. Any publishing company, and please other authors correct me in the future here. Any publishing company is going to first question, what's your platform, right? They want to know how you're going to participate in marketing this book, because you're expected to market this book. Like, this comes out, hello, since July, I have been every month, YouTube channel, LinkedIn, like you name it. I've got this big network, and I'm thinking of all these different ways to market myself. So I would actually suggest self-publishing. Get it going, right? Get your platform built up, get your sales, which would be really nice, because then you can hire an editor. Not like me, who didn't have one. And then you can still be published as a self-published author. So they'll pick you up, if you're doing well, and they see that you're doing well and you have this great social platform, they'll grab you up, they'll scoop you up and be like, hey, we can really make this worth, and they can take you to the next phase.
Great. Any other questions for Roy before we go on to our next speaker? I did have one. Have you heard from anybody who's been helped by your book? Have you? The readers of your book are probably not the students themselves, but have you heard from anyone who's changed how they do things based on what they've read in your book? Or
yes, some of the professors that I used to work with at my various institutions, I emailed them and I was like, it's out, oh my goodness, right? And then some of the people I worked with at the different food pantries, because I would work on this committee called Voices for Hunger, and we would do this every year. Anyway, yes, they, what really struck them, it was so funny, because it was like one page of the book, like you write this whole book and this one page, it was actually the poster. So a lot of the times they'll have a poster that advertises the food pantry, right? And on the poster, this particular one that I highlight in the book is full of American symbols, right? SpaghettiOs, beefaroni, sauce and noodles. You have a lot of students who aren't from the US. They don't know what Campbell's is. They don't know what SpaghettiOs is, right? They don't know what beefaroni is. They're going to look at that poster and they're going to think, not for me, right? And also a lot of the food pantries also carry feminine supplies and school supplies too. And they have perishable items. How do you know that from the poster, right? So it's so funny. The one professor was like, oh my goodness, we totally need to redo the poster. And he came up to me and he said, after reading this, he said, I realized that these student resources are great for some students, but not all students. And I was like, okay, so that was a real watershed moment. Thank you, Lori.
that's great, Roy. All right, thank you. Our next speaker is Robert Demanche, also known as Bob. Bob is the primary author of The Last of the Fairhaven Coasters, the story of Captain Claude S. Tucker and the schooner Coral, which was written with co-authors Donald F. Tucker and Caroline B. Tucker, and published in 2013 by the History Press, an imprint of Arcadia Publishing. From the early years of our nation, the coasting schooner served as the primary means of hauling the cargoes that fueled the country's growth. Several thousand of these coasters once existed, but by the late 1930s, relatively few remained. Among those still in operation was the coasting schooner Coral. In the last of the Fairhaven coasters, the authors used first-person accounts of crew members and captains to trace the life of the Coral and Captain Tucker. A longtime friend of the Tuckers and contributing author to both A Picture History of Fairhaven and Cranberry Harvest, a history of cranberry growing in Massachusetts, Bob especially enjoys family holiday gatherings where tales of modern maritime life are told. Robert grew up in Fairhaven and currently resides in Braintree.
Thanks.
Bob.
Okay, sure. Thanks, Laurie, and thanks, Roy, for sharing about your book. Also, thanks for inviting me to be on this panel, and I sent a few notices, and I'm happy that some of my friends and other people are on, and people get to share about this book. Yes, that's correct. I've been in Braintree for about 8 years, and much earlier I lived in Quincy for about 6 years. So that answers kind of but and I grew up in Fairhaven, which is about an hour south of Braintree, and it's right across the harbor from the great whaling and fishing port of New Bedford. And there's lots of opportunity if you want to write a narrative nonfiction book, such as my book is. And I'll get into my book shortly. It's the story of Captain Claude S. Tucker, who was a mariner in the early 1900s, and he owned a vessel called the Coral. The Coral was a schooner, it was a coasting schooner, and a coasting schooner basically went from one town to another, or one colony to another, or now a state to another along the coast, and they transported a lot of the bulk cargoes that the growing nation needed. It was very important, these types of vessels, very important in the 1700s, and then doing that, and it continued into the 1800s as the New England grew tremendously in population. And not only did they transport these goods, they were important because it was a way, when you had a couple of the crewmen going to another port, you shared news, you shared information, and it was one way of connecting the colonies when they were forming, and the other states as the nation was growing. And in the 18th century, the larger vessels, and I was wondering, maybe Laurie, could you put the slide up if you have a chance?
Yes, let me try to do that.
That's when you had the larger, the 3 masters, and the 4 and the 5 and the 6 masters. Yeah, I think is that PowerPoint? I think
there we go.
Do F5. Yeah.
Can you see it?
Yes, it looks great. Up on the right is Captain Tucker at the helm of the Coral, and the Coral is on the bottom left. You see it's loaded with 55-gallon drums of gasoline, about to head for Nantucket from Fairhaven. You had these larger vessels, which ultimately the 7-master, the largest vessel built. A lot of people in this area know of the Thomas W. Lawson, which was built up the road here at the Fall River shipyard. So but by the time the 30s came along, that era was ended. That era of carrying cargo by a sailing craft, which dates back to the Roman days, was now ended. So I just want to read a short couple of paragraphs from the book to talk a little bit about the book itself. And no, but it got grounded in the 1938 hurricane, and that was the end. That was the very end, where there were, once at one time there were thousands and thousands of these vessels, and by the 30s and 40s, maybe 50 on the East Coast. That's a guesstimate, but there were very few. Among them was the coral. So, looking back today, the thought of the coral's demise might bring forth a feeling of sadness, or at least wistfulness, that we will never again see the sight of her masts reaching above the rooftops along Fairhaven's waterfront. On the other hand, it is a wonder that Captain Tucker and the Coral continued to haul cargoes for as long as they did into the twilight years of the age of commercial sail. How could the Coral have lasted so long? Who was this Captain Tucker who owned and sailed the Coral for the last third of her 60-year career? And why did it matter that Fairhaven was their home? Why was this type of vessel and the work it did so important in the first place? And so the book is about that, and it's written for a general audience. But even those more knowledgeable in maritime stories will, they'll find something that's interesting, and they'll learn. I just like to finish up with the sort of the evolution of this book. The last of the Fairhaven Coasters was published by the History Press in 2013, but it originated about 25 years earlier. And as far as the authors, you see in the center, Donald Tucker. Don Tucker was the youngest son of Captain Tucker. He remembers sailing as a 5 or 6 year old aboard the Coral, and he very fortunately recorded his father on tape recorder in later years. So there were several tapes that were very valuable to us. And he had been asked by Mystic Seaport to do a talk at their symposium about the Coral. And he, at that time, enlisted the aid of his sons. I don't know if they were engaged or they had gotten married, they had become married at that point or what, but his daughter-in-law, Carrie Tucker, you see on the left, she helped extract all the information from the tapes and develop helped him gather photographs and create the script for the talk and write a short little manuscript of what they had found, and they thought they might do a booklet about it at some point. And then I came along in the mid-90s, and I really thought that it needed, it was a bigger story and it should get a bigger play. And so what I did was to build on Carrie's original text and expand it into, we did a self-published book, which came out, we brought it out in October of 1998. And then, Mr. Tucker wanted to get a larger geographic range. I saw where the writing could need improvement. And what I did by this time, it was Donald Tucker and myself working on the book, and as I like to say, I overhauled the original version from stem to stern. We were fortunate that the History Press published our book, and we continued, like the first book, to do a lot of book signings and talks, and still selling the book, primarily in the Fairhaven area, and that's the business history press's business model. But still, now that I'm up here, I'm still selling the book, and also I'm learning a lot about the South Shore and Boston, which itself has a great, they have maritime heritage, and each town has its maritime heritage. So I think, I have plans for the future, but I think I'm just going to end right there with my description of the last of the Fairhaven coasters, and I'll turn it back to you, Laura. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you. I do want to try to share the information about your book while we see if a few questions come in. If anyone has a question for Bob, please put them into the chat. I'm going to share the information about the book if I can find it.
And could you read them? I can't access them very well.
What's that?
Could you read the questions from the chat? Because I can't.
Oh, I will, yes.
Okay.
Except now I'm not sure if I can see the chat. Oh, I think that was, oh, here we go, I can. Let's see. How long did it take to write the book? This is a question from Roy. I think to write the overhaul, Roy?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I think we got the contract in November. I had already done some work on it, and the book was published the following May, so it was due to the History Press April 1st. It was a little bit of an ongoing project, but I really put the major effort in that time period I just mentioned.
Okay, great. I'm just gonna look at the chat. So I did see Marie had a hand raised. I'm sorry, Marie, can you type the question into the chat? I don't know how to get you back onto, how to get you onto audio. We really just have the panelists on audio. Do you have any tips, Bob, for people who are working on a collaborative writing project, like you did, as you did with the Tuckers?
Yes, and the collaborative aspect, for the first part, it was Carrie and Mr. Tucker, and then for the self-published and then History Press, it was primarily a collaboration between Mr. Tucker and myself. So, and our roles were very separated because I did basically the writing aspects, and he.
Bob was having some Wi-Fi issues. Give him 1 minute to come back. Okay, we'll let him sign off and come back on, and then I will get to the other question that came through. He's probably going to end up signing off. So we will just move on to our next speaker, Marcy, and we'll come back to Bob and the questions because he did have a little time left on the question and answers. There he is.
That would be.
Okay, Bob, we kind of lost you there.
Oh, geez. Okay.
Yeah.
I would say, yeah. Okay. I basically would say I won't repeat the whole thing, but because I really only collaborated with Donald Tucker, and our roles were separate. I did the writing and the research. He filled his knowledge research, made that available. So I can't really talk to the collaborative aspects, except my guess would be that if I have a particular strength in an area, let me take the lead. If the other person has a particular strength, let that person take the lead. That may help, make things fit together. I would possibly suggest that.
Okay, great. Then another question was that a comment that the cover of your book is beautiful, and how did you find a designer, if you did find the designer?
That's that was done by a graphic artist who was connected with the History Press. And if you notice all the History Press books, if you go to any of the, Barnes and Nobles, they have excellent, attractive, great covers, basically. So the History Press artist, we made suggestions of photos. That would be it.
Okay,
And they designed the interior of it too, the layout and stuff.
okay, great. All right, well, thank you. Oh, Roy's just mentioning that she didn't have an artist for her book from
Yeah.
her publisher. Yeah, so the publishers vary from in that regard, what they do for you and for your book. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you, Bob. We will come back to other questions if anyone has any. Oops, sorry, my timer. If other people have questions for any of the authors, you can feel free to type them in as we talk, as we go along, and I will moderate the questions and we can try to get to as many as we can. So we will go on to our next speaker. Our third and final speaker is Margie Mccreary, whose novel, The Disappearance of Trudy Solomon, was published by Camcat Books in September. In it, an accomplished detective teams up with her father, a retired cop, to retrace a cold kidnapping case, only to realize that the clues reach deep into her past and uncomfortably close to home. After graduating from George Washington University with a BA in American Literature and Political Science, Margie pursued a career in the marketing field, holding executive positions in marketing, communications, and sales at various magazine publishing companies and content marketing agencies. With 2 daughters and 2 stepdaughters living in 4 cities, Los Angeles, Nashville, Madison, Seattle, Margie has spent a lot of time in airplanes crisscrossing the country, or at least at a certain time. She lives in Hull with her husband, Lou, and Black Lab, Chloe. And Marcie's, you're next.
Thank you. So I guess I'm a little bit different from you guys in the nonfiction world, and I can get a little bit into that later, sort of the different paths between fiction publishing and nonfiction, because it is completely different. But just to focus on my book a little bit, I think the number one question that I get is, what was the inspiration for my novel? So that's sort of where I'd like to start. And it's very interesting sort of where ideas come from. So a few years ago, October 2017 to be exact, I read this article in the Boston Globe. And what's interesting about it is not just the story itself about this woman who, her name was Flora Stevens, disappeared 40 years ago from a Catskills Resort hotel. She was a waitress there. And 40 years later, in a fluke of luck and new technology, her social security, someone detective does a search on her social security number and gets a ping in Lowell, Massachusetts. And they're like, could this be her? They drive out to Lowell and they have her Concord hotel ID, and she's got Alzheimer's. But she's got very distinct blue eyes. They're 100% sure it's her. And she even recognizes a picture of her husband and she names him. And so I read this article, and the first thing that comes into my head is like, okay, what happened to her in those 40 years? I mean, maybe something bad happened. Maybe she was kidnapped. Maybe she ran away from a bad situation. And it just would not let go. I just could not let go of this story. But I think what really made it even sort of more nagging to me is that I actually spent my summers in the Catskill resorts, and I never heard this story. And this took place in the mid-70s, and I was a teenager. And so I had this connection to the Catskill regions and this woman in a very peripheral way. And then the fact that she ended up in Massachusetts and nobody got to tell her story just stayed with me in a way that I found that I needed to write a story about it. And as I sat down to write, I guess the first thought in my mind was, well, who's telling the story? Is it this woman, Flora Stevens, who I renamed as Trudy Solomon? Is it the detective? Is it the original detective on the case who couldn't find her 40 years ago? Yeah, is it somebody else? So once I established that I wanted it to be a police procedural, that I wanted it to be a mystery and a detective story, I thought, and also my father, the reason my connection to the Catskills is my father was what was called a tumler, an activities director at one of the hotels there. Actually, several hotels there, but I grew up in one hotel, the Hotel Brickman. And so I had this connection in my head also with my father and his connection to the area. So the daughter-father thing came very quick to me. What if I paired the original detective on the case with his daughter, who's now a police detective, to figure out what happened to Trudy Solomon? And they're coming at it from two different places. For the dad, this is an itch he needs to scratch. I mean, this is his white whale. This is like Moby Dick. Like, he has never been able to solve the case, and he's a really good detective. So here's an opportunity to kind of figure out if there was any malfeasance along the way. Get justice served if justice needs to be served. For the detective, Susan Ford, this is more about this sense of giving this woman her a life back, to tell her story, sort of where I came from it. And she's actually in a pretty sticky situation as the book opens. She is being investigated by Internal Affairs for shooting of a teenager. And so she's got just a pile of everything on top of her, and needs to kind of just see her way through to sort of something new and different. And so that's why she decides to take on this case, even though the police chief, she's getting no support for this. I mean, it's a case that's pretty much closed. She joins her father and off they go. And what they need to do is interview, think of any cold case fiction that you see on television. What you're starting to do is interview people that memories have gone bad. Memories even change over time. Looking for people who knew Trudy Solomon, who knew the owners of the hotel, people today who might be able to shed some light. And so they utilize a lot of technology, using Facebook and LinkedIn, and things that they can utilize to find people from her past. And they begin to piece together what happened to her. All roads lead back to where she worked, the fictional Cutman Hotel. And you begin to also see the family that owned that hotel. And what I'd like to bring into it as well is that Susan and her father and her mother had their own family issues. The Cutmans had their own family issues. And yet you always have the sense that the grass is greener on the other side. And so she begins to really understand sort of the family dynamics that were happening at the time isn't what it seemed. And so that also sort of brings her character arc to kind of come to some ideals that she had back when she was young, and sort of set the record straight. And what I really liked about setting this in the Catskills is that the Catskills itself has its own character arc. You had the heyday of the Catskills, everybody's seen Dirty Dancing and the Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. And then the area starts to decline. And there's this time period, probably between the time 1978, 1985, where the beginning of the decline starts. And then there's a just huge slide after 1985. And so I thought that was important as well, as sort of along with the character arcs of Trudy Solomon, Susan Ford, her father, Will Ford, her mother, Vera Ford, and the Cutman family, sort of their life as sort of moving in the same arc as the area itself. So the area almost becomes a character in itself. So a little bit about the writing process. So I'm what's called a pantser as opposed to a plotter. I just sit down and I let the characters take me on the journey for the first 3/4 of the book. So I have a general idea of where it's going and who did what and how it ends up, but it's not plotted at all. I'm just it's a police procedural. It's very logical. You uncover something, it takes you to the next lead. The next lead takes you to the next lead. So it's very natural to write that way when you're doing a mystery. But when I got to the last quarter of the book, that's where I sort of have to start plotting. I have to make sure that the red herrings there are enough red herrings in there, that the clues make sense, that I'm not leading the reader down such, the wrong path, just kind of give them some clues, but leave them guessing. I have to say that my editor, we rewrote, I would say, a lot of that, the last quarter of the book, which is interesting. Like the stuff that I pantsed, pretty much was fine. And the stuff that I plotted needed a lot of work. So it's just kind of interesting. Like once I had to get down to the nitty gritty, it wasn't as natural for me to write that way, to write against a plot, to kind of tie things up. But it took me about a year to write the book, and I was querying when there was one of those Twitter Pit Mad contests where you get to pitch in 240 characters. And unfortunately, a lot of the networking, a lot of the things that I was going to go to and meet agents and editors, they all got canceled. I mean, this is it's 2020. So what happened was it sort of does limit you. I mean, it really is important to go to these events and meet these people and pitch in person. But there are other ways to do it. And PitMed was available to me. It's a quarterly contest through Twitter. You've got agents and editors looking at all of these authors pitching 240 characters. And I got the attention of a number of people this way, one of them being CamCat Books. So mine was I think, a pretty strange journey, which is, I decided to go that route instead of continuing to go to an agent. It PitMad, PITMAD. I see somebody just said this. And it's put on by an organization called Pitch Wars, which does similar contests in other ways throughout the year. And I know a lot of people that have been picked up through PitMad. So it actually does work for a lot of authors. Get your pitch down to 240 characters. So there is a sequel to the book. I also want to bring that up as well. So what happened was I was not planning on writing a sequel to the book. Susan Ford and Will Ford were going to be a one-off. And then I got this really great review from Publishers Weekly that said, in this enticing series launch, more than one twist will catch the reader by surprise. And I'm like, what? And my publisher's like, do you have another book? And I was like, yeah, I have an idea for another book, which I started writing as soon as that came out, which was in March, about 6 months before my book was published. So I started writing it in March, April, and I just finished it yesterday. Yeah. So it's in time for the deadline to get it to the publisher. So a little bit about how much time do I have?
Oh, well, I was going to say that actually brings us to your questions, which, one of them is, will there be another book? So
yes. Yeah. So hopefully, so I have to, in my contract was a 1-book deal. So I do have to go through the process again. So it gets handed off, but it's a slightly different route. It gets handed back to my publisher, and they will determine whether they want to go with it or not. So, and then we start the process all over again. It takes a year from the time I hand it off and they accept it to getting it released. And that's because there's about 3 months of developmental editing and then putting together the marketing plan, the cover, getting it into the catalog so that it is presented then to the Barnes & Noble and the independent booksellers of the world. So a lot goes into that, once you hand the book off, it's like now a whole new process of editing and marketing. And just, quickly about the difference between nonfiction and fiction, as Roy mentioned, in nonfiction authors these days, especially nonfiction narrative, it is imperative to have a platform. If you don't have a platform, if you don't already have followers, a publisher really doesn't want to start you from scratch. They want to know that you already have a huge, that you're already expert in your field and that you already have a following. And the other piece that they do is what's called a proposal. So you don't have to have a whole book ready. You just have to have a proposal and an outline along with your platform. And then they decide whether or not they want to go with you or not, and will fund you to do your book, or maybe not fund you to do your book. Whereas in fiction, what you do to get ready is after you have your manuscript done, and that means like your fifth draft, like after alpha readers, beta readers, revisions, reading it until you want to vomit a million times until you feel like it is absolutely tight and ready to go. Do not query. Okay, because that was an early mistake that I made. So what you do is you query, and a query is generally just a cold letter to an agent, a cold email saying, kind of just presenting what your book is about as short an email as you could possibly do. And sometimes they ask for anywhere from 3 pages to 50 pages. And sometimes they want what's called the synopsis, which is boiling down your 90,000 word book to 1,000 words to tell them what happens, like, from beginning to end. So I actually find it way harder to write a synopsis than I do to write a 90,000 word novel. And then once you are ready, you start pitching agents. And that's the process. Yeah.
Well, there was a question about the rewriting the end of the book that you mentioned. What did you have anything that you wish you hadn't changed, or were you happy with the changes that you made? Or
I'm really happy with the changes that we made. So one of the changes has to do with the Trudy, what we call Trudy vignettes. They are these little sections from Trudy's point of view. Now, remember, she has Alzheimer's. And I kind of struggled with, well, how do I present Trudy's point of view? At one point, I actually did like flashbacks where she was actually living in 1978, and you got a sense of her life at that time. I did one where she has Alzheimer's, but she has flashbacks to then. And then I decided to actually this was the editor's idea, is to actually put her in the moment and have her as sort of the unreliable narrator. She tells her story as she's living in the moment, but she doesn't know what's real and what's not. And there are clues in there for the reader to kind of figure out, whether or not she's presenting what she remembers accurately or not. So that was one part of it, the Trudy vignettes. And the last quarter of it, we actually changed who did it, like who the perp was actually changed. One of the storylines changed, not both. There are two plots. So one of the storylines changed completely, and we kind of worked like how it would work. Everything leading up to the ending still worked, even though we changed the ending. And I think it's just a stronger novel because of it. I find it very clever. It's complex, but it's clever. There are aspects of the novel that I would change now that it's been out there. But I don't want to think about it. Like, there are things that I know I would change. Like, and I'll just leave it at that. So, live and learn. I think those are things that I brought with me, though, as I was writing my second novel. The things, sort of lessons learned from writing the first novel and bringing it into the second novel. I think the second novel is tighter, actually, because of that.
right. Well, great. Thank you. We are coming up on 8 o'clock, so I do want to remind everyone, if you had any other questions for any of the authors, please type them into the chat. There was a question about the pitching. Was that on Twitter? And what was it exactly called?
It's called Pit Mad, PITMAD.
MAD.
Yeah, and it's quarterly, like.
Okay.
January, like I can't remember it, but you can go to Pitch Wars. I think it's pitchwars.com or pitchwars.org, but just type in Pitch Mad and you will find it on Google.
Yeah. I do want to mention too that the library has a writers group, and Roy and Bob have both been coming. And I don't know, Marcy, if you're a part of a writers group or not.
I have colleagues, and for like CamCat, we are pretty tight family of all the authors, which is really nice, especially when it comes to marketing. We really do help each other with interviewing each other for each other's blogs and Instagram live interviews, and helping each other navigate Goodreads and BookBub and Amazon. And doing social media correctly. So in that way, I really rely on them a lot. And then I love to go to these networking events. I just came from New England Crime Bake. I was supposed to be on the panel at VoucherCon last year, which is a big mystery conference. It was down in New Orleans just as Delta hit. And so the Delta variant. So, again, going to these panels, networking, finding writers who are in the same category, just sort of becoming friends with them, even if they're virtual friends, it is really helpful. Haven't gone to a lot of writers things lately. I mean, I don't think anybody has, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you were able to come to this virtual one. And I do want to share the screen for Roy's book, which I didn't get to do. Let me see if I can get that to work. I don't know why it's not. Let me see if I can make it bigger this way. Oh, there we go. How's
Ooh.
that? There we go. You
Yeah.
can see it now. Okay. Just I wanted to make sure we did that. Everybody's books, I believe, are available through the Old Colony Library Network as well, but they are all able to be purchased through any of the online booksellers, as you can see. And let's see if we can go back. I think there was another question. This one was for Marcy about any of the characters based on people that you know. I think a lot of authors get that question, or fiction authors anyway.
Not really. I mean, they're not even composites of people I know. I think the beauty of fiction is really coming out with people you don't know. Now, I borrow from maybe real incidences in my life. There's this story about this drunk driving incident that was actually happened to me and my husband. And when you read the book, you'll see what I mean. But that's actually a true story. So I might take, like real life little vignettes in my life that I find to be interesting or funny and weave them into the book in some way. But as far as the characters are concerned, I don't think any of these characters are based on anyone I know. Not even me. Like Susan Ford is not me. Everyone says, "Oh, you Susan Ford." I'm like, no, I'm not Susan Ford. No, my mother is not an alcoholic. No, my father was not a police detective. My father's gregarious, like Will Ford is. He's a social people person, but he's not my father. Again, you take from what you know and the experiences around you. But no, these are fictional characters.
Right. And Roy, I believe you said before that you have been writing all your life. And do you also write some fiction and poetry as well? Or do you?
Oh, thank you, Lori, for remembering. Yes. So poetry, children's stories, fiction, nonfiction, you name it, it has words in it. I'm writing it. Also in French and Greek too. So I'm all about the words. Yeah, it's wonderful. Not the base. Just kidding.
And Bob, you mentioned the other, or we mentioned in your introduction, the two other books that you had written. I wonder if you could just briefly say how you found the publishers for those. Did you submit the manuscripts, or did they approach you for the cranberry growing history? And
yes, the two books were A Picture History of Fairhaven and Cranberry Harvest, a history of cranberry growing in Massachusetts. I was a contributing author to that, so I wrote several sections, and there were many sections in each book. That was done through Spinner Publications in the mid '80s, and it was I first got to know them through doing research at the new Free Public Library in New Bedford, up in the genealogy room, and their archival collection. So it was a direct connection, and Spinner was from New Bedford itself. So it still is actually. They did a lot of local history.
Okay.
And they branched out since then.
Okay. All right, great. Well, I want to thank you all. I just want to mention that we've had several comments from the audience. I don't know if you've had a chance to see them. Thanking you all for your very interesting presentations. And also a thank you for keeping reading alive. I think that was from Roy to the audience.
Yeah.
No, it is great that you've come to support local authors, because I think as a librarian, I mean, I see it all the time. People are reluctant to take a chance on an unknown author. Everybody wants to read the authors they already have heard of and they already know. So it's nice, a leap of faith to take a chance on a local author. And so we do appreciate your support for coming tonight. And I want to thank all three of you for speaking tonight. Very, very interesting and informative.
Thank you, Lori.
Thank
Thanks,
you, Lori, for all your work.
Thank
Hard
you.
work. Yes.
Thank
And Marcy and Roy also.
All right. And
Yeah,
just
so
remember,
nice to meet you all.
you can watch for the show on the community cable access channels.
Good.
So let's see, one more new message before we close. Another thank you. Thank you. It was great. And we do this twice a year, so keep us in mind for future. And if you've written a book, if you're in the audience and you've written a book, get in touch with us at Thayer Public Library. All right. Thank you all and
Great.
good night.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Bye.
Good night. Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you.